Ginny Weasley found a prophecy fragment she wasn't supposed to find. She read it wrong, and then she made a decision that altered the entire architecture of the war. Alone, at 2 in the morning, at 17 years old, and told nobody. 3 weeks before Harry left to hunt Horcruxes, Ginny broke into the restricted section of the Hogwarts library, not for rebellion, for him. She'd been watching Harry come apart quietly for months, the weight behind his eyes, the way he moved through rooms as if he was already practicing being absent from them, and she needed to understand what she was up against. She found an obscure divination text crumbling at the spine, annotated in 3 different hands across 2 centuries. On page 47, a prophecy fragment that no one had apparently thought significant enough to remove. She read the critical line 4 times. The chosen one must approach the threshold untethered, unmourned by the living, for the old magic to complete itself. She closed the book. She sat in the dark for a long time. Then she made her decision. 2 days later, she ended it with Harry in the garden at the Burrow. She was precise and she was cold, and she gave him reasons that weren't the real reason, because the real reason was that she'd concluded his survival depended on her cruelty. She told him he'd already left, that he was somewhere else even when he was standing in front of her. All of it true enough to work, none of it the point. Harry didn't argue. That was the part that broke something in her permanently. He just absorbed it, the way he absorbed everything, with the terrible patience of someone who'd been preparing for loss his entire life. He nodded once. He walked back into the house, and Ginny stood in the garden, knowing she'd just surgically removed the one thing that made her feel like the war was survivable, and told herself this was what love looked like when love had to be tactical. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, reading a passage in poor light while terrified, was that she'd misread the word that mattered. Untethered didn't mean alone. It meant unafraid of sacrifice. Those aren't the same thing. The difference between them is the entire difference between a man who walks into death with nothing to lose and a man who walks into death because everything he loves is worth the cost of it. One is exhaustion, the other is the oldest magic in the world. Lily Potter had known the difference. She had walked toward death carrying love like a weapon. Ginny, trying to replicate that sacrifice, had just dismantled the mechanism entirely. She realized her mistake 6 days later, in better light, rereading the passage with a clear head and a pounding heart. By then, Harry was gone.
Harry Potter didn't fall apart. That would have been easier to watch. Instead, he became something precise and cold and extraordinarily effective. A version of himself with all the warmth surgically removed. And Ron and Hermione spent 8 months pretending not to be frightened by it. The Horcrux hunt moved faster in this version. That was the first thing Hermione noticed and couldn't bring herself to name as a problem. Harry made decisions in seconds that previously would have required hours of argument. He didn't second guess. He didn't stop to consider the cost to himself, because the cost to himself had become abstract, a calculation he'd quietly stopped running. He was effective the way a tool is effective, precisely, without sentiment, without the friction of self-preservation getting in the way. Ron noticed it at the forest camp in October, watching Harry stare at a tactical map at 3 in the morning, and understanding suddenly that Harry wasn't thinking about what came after. Not because he'd given up, he hadn't, the mission mattered to him completely, but because after had become theoretical, a country he'd stopped planning to visit. Hermione's word for it, written in her journal and never spoken aloud, indifference, not to the mission, to himself inside it. The locket Horcrux, when they found it, tried to do what it always did, reached into the wearer's deepest fears and pulled them to the surface. For Ron, it found the fear of being overshadowed. For Hermione, it found the fear of failure. For Harry, it found Ginny, standing in the Burrow garden, alive and summer-lit and turning away from him. And Harry looked at it with complete steadiness and said nothing, and the locket's eye flickered with something that might have been confusion. Dark magic requires a wound to leverage. A wound that's been sealed over with enough deliberate numbness becomes armor of a kind. The locket couldn't find purchase. Harry destroyed it without flinching, and Hermione watched him do it and felt afraid of something she couldn't quite name. Meanwhile, at Hogwarts under Death Eater control, Ginny Weasley was running a resistance operation with the methodical fury of someone who has redirected every personal feeling into a cause. Neville and Luna and the remnants of Dumbledore's army, graffiti of encouragement on the dungeon walls, stolen food for students in punishment detention, a protective network built from loyalty and spite. She was extraordinary at it. She was also moving through the school like a person who has already spent their grief and is now operating purely on what remains after grief runs out. The students who followed her didn't know why she felt so combustible. They didn't need to. They needed her to be effective, and she was. She wrote Harry 3 letters she never sent, not because she was afraid of owls being intercepted. The content was coded, she could have managed it, but because she didn't know what the letters were for. Not warning him because she couldn't explain the prophecy without explaining the decision, and she couldn't explain the decision without confessing that she'd read a fragment of text and unilaterally redesigned the emotional architecture of his war without asking him. Not love letters because she'd made love tactical and wasn't sure she had the right to make it personal again. The letters sat in her trunk under 3 layers of other things, and they were occasionally added to, and they were never sent, and they accumulated into a record of everything she should have said differently.
Dumbledore's plan had one load-bearing assumption buried inside it that nobody had written down anywhere: that Harry Potter would walk into the Forbidden Forest carrying enough love to power the oldest magic in existence. Nobody had checked whether that was still true. Harry walked into the forest knowing he had to die. He'd worked it out from Snape's memories with the cold precision that had characterized everything he'd done for 8 months. He wasn't afraid. That was the thing. He genuinely wasn't afraid. And the absence of fear wasn't courage in the traditional sense, but rather the specific fearlessness of someone who has quietly stopped valuing their own survival above the mission's completion. He dropped the resurrection stone after speaking briefly with the dead. He walked forward. He let Voldemort cast the curse. And then, nothing. Not King's Cross, not the warm white light, not Dumbledore in his most extraordinary robes, not the conversation that was supposed to give Harry the information he needed to choose to return. Just cold, just dark, just silence with no one waiting in it. The mechanism had misfired. Lily Potter's sacrifice had worked because she chose death with love so completely that it became a shield. The same magic required an echo in Harry, the willingness to die for something specific, for people specifically loved, the act of self-sacrifice carrying the full weight of what was being protected. Harry had walked in with pure will and total mission focus, and the efficient numbness of someone who'd excised the personal element from his own story. He was willing to die. He was not dying for anyone in particular. And the distinction, in the grammar of the oldest magic, was everything. He came back anyway, not from a meaningful threshold, but simply from unconsciousness, because Narcissa Malfoy still needed him to be alive, because Voldemort still needed to believe the announcement, because the physical chain of events unspooled the way it always would. He woke on the forest floor with nothing received, no message, no choice, no understanding of what had just happened or failed to happen. He got up. He went back to the castle. He ended the war, because Harry Potter gets up
always, regardless of what he was or wasn't given. Voldemort died. The castle stood. The morning came. In the great hall, Ginny felt the moment of the curse from across the grounds, some remnant of the connection that couldn't be severed by a decision made in a library at 2 in the morning, and said his name into the air above the wounded and the dead, quietly, not to anyone, just into the space between herself and whatever was happening beyond the tree line. And then she waited. And then he came back. And then the war was over.
Voldemort was dead. Harry was alive. By any measure, the plan had worked. Ginny found Harry in the courtyard rubble and told him everything. The library, the fragment, the misreading, the decision, the 3 unsent letters. All of it without softening any of it, because she owed him the full account and she knew it. Harry listened the way he'd been listening to everything for 8 months, with complete attention and no readable expression. Then he told her about the dark. Not King's Cross, just cold and silence. No Dumbledore, no white light, no choice. He'd woken up on the forest floor, not knowing if he'd died and returned or simply blacked out and recovered, because there was no messenger, no information, nothing on the other side waiting to receive him. Hermione understood it first, 2 days later, when Harry described it again in more detail. She went very still. She had read everything Dumbledore left, every note, every calculation, every layer of the plan. Dumbledore had needed Harry to have a conversation at that threshold. Specific information had to be delivered there. Harry had to be told, in that liminal space, that he was a Horcrux, that Voldemort had unintentionally made him one, and that the piece of Voldemort's soul inside him had been destroyed by the killing curse, leaving Harry himself intact and returnable. Without that conversation, Harry hadn't known to come back. He'd come back anyway, by accident, by Narcissa's lie, by the pure mechanical continuation of events. But the piece of Voldemort's soul in Harry had it been destroyed. Without the conversation, without the confirmation, without the deliberate choice made at the threshold, Hermione wasn't certain. And Hermione being not certain about something in the architecture of the plan was the most frightening thing that had happened since the war ended. They checked. It took 3 weeks and 4 different diagnostic spells and a consultation with a healer who specialized in curse residue. The soul fragment was gone, destroyed by the killing curse as it was always going to be. That part had worked, but something else hadn't. Some deep structural working of the magic, the part that was supposed to close something in the fabric of things, some wound in the wizarding world's core that Voldemort had torn open across decades, hadn't completed. Dumbledore's plan had required the full mechanism, the love, the threshold, the choice, the return made consciously and freely. Harry had returned. He hadn't chosen it. And choice, in the grammar of the magic that had governed everything since Lily Potter died in a nursery in Godric's Hollow, was not optional. It was the point. The war was over. Voldemort was dead. The damage he'd done to the deep structure of magic, to the old protections, to the spells that kept certain ancient things sealed, was mostly healed. Mostly. In certain forgotten rooms of the Ministry, certain cold spots persisted. In certain places where dark magic had been practiced for generations, the wards that should have dissolved after Voldemort's death stayed faintly active, as if not fully convinced the threat was gone. In the Department of Mysteries, the veil moved slightly differently than it had before. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would write a report about for years. Just the persistent low hum of something that hadn't quite been finished. A war won on points, not by knockout, leaving something unresolved in the foundations of things.